Right, everyone, welcome back to Idiot Seeking Village. Rich here. Adam, are you ready to learn about how Fidel Castro comes about?
Yes, sir.
All right.
I'm very, very excited.
Refill your Cuba Libre. Make sure you get that little squeeze of lime in there. That's the key.
And the real sugar Coke.
Yes, and of course, real sugar Coke, of course. I mean, please, Cuba's a plantation country. Yeah, you need the real sugar. All right, so where we had left off, real quick, Fulgencio Batista comes in. So Batista was a mixed-race Cuban. He was from a poor working-class family. He was an NCO in the Cuban army. And a month after Machado fled, he led what's called the Sergeants' Revolt, which overthrew that discredited officer corps and replaced them with the NCOs. Basically, they kicked out their bosses and made themselves the bosses. The new officer corps allied themselves with the student organizations, and they installed a civilian junta to oversee a provisional government. And this is notable because for the first time in a long time, Cuban political order was restored without U.S. military intervention. At the same time, the good neighbor policy went to a result. They also rescinded the Platt Amendment. So the U.S. is no longer coming in here, and now this is the Cubans restoring order for themselves. So broadly speaking, for the next 5 years, you had this kind of provisional government. Batista, he's now a colonel, and he declared himself chief of the army because he's running the insurrection. He was the power behind the throne. He had a bunch of puppet presidents and puppet politicians, but he's the guy behind the curtain who's shaping politics, acting as an intermediary between different power blocks, because again, he was the only guy with the actual infrastructure and organization to make things happen from 1935 till about 1940. But he's not a bastard at this point. He's actually just kind of like trying to get stuff done and get Cuba organized. 1940, they finally issue a new constitution. It is actually an incredibly progressive constitution and very forward-looking, quite an impressive document. They adopt it successfully. They run an election, and Batista successfully wins the presidency. So he moves from the man behind the curtain and the de facto power behind the throne to actually the official head of state from 1940 to 1944 for the first term under the new Cuban Republic. He rules normally within constitutional limits, not something you'd expect from a guy who comes from a military background and who had been in power, right? He cultivated support from the Libre unions and the communists. He maintained close relations with the U.S. throughout World War II. By all accounts, was a perfectly normal, moderate parliamentary politician. He lost the election in 1944 to Ramon Grau San Martin. He transferred power peacefully, and he left the country. He retired to Florida. Sounds like it. European observers sent people to watch the transfer of power from Washington, right after the first election, after the Constitution was adopted, and they expected shit to go sideways, and it didn't, right? Peaceful transfers of power, especially under a new Constitution, don't really happen that often, or at least they're fraught. This wasn't.
I'm surprised he lost so quickly.
So since we're part, I didn't really dig in on the details of that, but yeah, the important part is he accepts his defeat and he's like, all right, I'm out of here. I'm gonna leave the country. He's like, I don't want to be, a problem. He's like, I know. It's almost like he recognized, hey, like having a military guy in the background who lost the election is going to be distracting, right? Let me just get out of here. So remember now in part 2, remember how Machado had left Cuba in shambles after the end of his term? On Batista's exit, it's back. He's brought it back. Sugar prices and the economy, they all bounce back. The Constitution, as I mentioned, is super progressive and it had a genuine framework for democratic governance. Labor was organized and the communists were in the loop with the labor people and they were chill. They weren't fighting back. They weren't violent. The student activists were growing into leadership class, into professional roles. And importantly, after years of the military pervading all aspects of life in Cuba, they had the basis to move on from that. The military had successfully been extracted from the government and civilian life. Everything was coming up Milhouse.
And it's not a very long period of time to achieve all that, even though it's just an island. It's still pretty impressive.
Exactly. It's actually it's wild reading the story up to this point. So what happens next is, Adam, just absolutely nothing short of a tragedy. Ramon Grau San Martin and his Authentico party, they peacefully take power in a democratic election, and almost immediately an absolutely laughable amount of corruption pervades the entire government. Government contracts went to friends and family. No-show jobs were prevalent. Theft by officials was just right out in the open. Corruption, bribery, theft. It was there. That's all they were doing, and they were all doing it.
He was our Donald Trump.
I'll table that one for now. They made a mockery of the idea of democratic institutions and moral governance. And the crazy part is they ran on this kind of nationalistic moral governance, good governance platform. That was their whole thing. The second they got into power, they're like, I'm rich, bitch. So
yes, sounds very much like us.
Very much. So on the labor front, everything was going swimmingly until 1947, right? So we're 2-3 years later into the post-election when the Cold War kicks in. And Grau, in a move that's clearly pushed by Washington, purges the communists from the Labor Party. He then replaces Labor's leadership, because Labor's leadership had been a communist, and he accomplished what Machado had once tried to do. He subverted Labor's independence, and he brought them under the government's control at the same time. Labor, which had this level of independence and legitimacy to it, is now brought into the government, which is rife with mass corruption and delegitimacy over the last 2-3 years. So suddenly, Labor is now completely corrupted alongside the government. And I mentioned a few times the student radicals, right? They've kind of moved on. They're now in society. They never disarmed. And they never actually shut down their respective organizations during the initial Batista regime. Two groups in particular were the Socialist Revolutionary Movement and the Insurrectionist Revolutionary Union. They joined in on the government graft and corruption, right? Remember, I said these students were now in the government. This is where they were through their organizations, but they were part of these organizations which kind of grafted onto the government for various functions. But since they were still armed and they were semi-independent, there ended up being a lot of gangsterism and street violence. What do you expect when your government is just full of bribery and corruption and graft, and you've got armed groups who attach themselves to it? They're going to engage in kind of mafia-style street violence as a result to defend their pocketbooks, right? To defend their bag. And they had de facto government protection while they were doing it. So turf warfare and assassinations went from being the purview of secret police then to ordinary Cubans. It became the face of the Authentico government that was in power. And because of the way the grifting worked, it rewarded this street violence because they got rich off of it. So the state was turning into a mafia organization, a mafia racket, basically, which, funny enough, the actual mafia held a conference in Havana in 1946. I'm just imagining mobsters in like some bland hotel conference hall, like noshing on crappy buffet food and wearing name tags on lanyards, identifying which family they're from. Yeah.
Yes, I'm from the Jew group. What was it? I can't remember their name. Like Liar Mansky? No. Meyer Lansky. Is that correct?
Yep. Meyer Lansky. That was the guy. Exactly.
Meyer Lansky here.
Yeah, exactly. I'm thinking from Godfather, Hyman Roth, right?
Yes. That was exactly the other one. Yep.
Yep. So yeah, Meyer Lansky, exactly. He was the big name in Havana during this time. So another fun fact, just a little bit of a side note, everyone's favorite cigar chomping bearded revolutionary was part of that Insurrectionist Revolutionary Union as a student. So he was there, and he was actually the target of an attack once, not because of who he was in particular, but just because he was part of the group. And he survived an assassination attempt, a bombing. So 1947, we're 3 years into this post-Batista military-run Cuba, and everything is turning to shit. The new Authentico candidate, Carlos Prio, he wins in 1948, so the same political party continues to keep power, and he gets some big-picture accomplishments, but the graft, corruption, and violence just continue to expand and grow. It's getting even worse. And he did my personal favorite strongman dictator move, and he built himself an opulent estate on the public dime. Which I think that's the real baller move, right? Any dictator has to have a secret police, but not all of them have the pizzazz to pull off the palatial estate built by government money.
But if you're really baller status, you get corporations to do it.
So at this time, Batista returned from Florida, and he actually successfully ran for a Senate seat in that 1948 election as well. So he's back. So during Trio's election run, one of the Authenticos, a guy named Eduardo Chibas, he was a party member, and he believed in their moral governance, good governance, Cuban nationalist kind of shtick. He's had enough, and he breaks off and he starts what's called the Cubans People Party, or the Ortodoxos, the Orthodox Party. Their platform was basically, y'all screwed this up. We need to stop the corruption and actually live up to the ideals, right? We're going to be Orthodox. We're going back to our roots as a party, which we're clearly not engaging in. This dude, Eduardo Chibas, he had a radio show. So he's a podcaster, just like us. Look at that. His show was basically part political sermon, part personal attacks, and part investigative expose. So I think you and I would have gotten along pretty well with him. His signature phrase was vergüenza contra dinero, shame against money. And this was a message that he went out there every week, and he exposed the money and greed that had corrupted Cuba's leadership and its institutions. And this message resonated. Approaching the 1952 election, it looked, right, polls looked like the Ortodoxos were going to win and Chibas was going to be the next president. But this weird thing happened. In August of 1951, a few months before the election, Chibas teased on his next show that he was going to expose the Minister of Education for corruption with specific documentary evidence. Chibas goes on the air, and he couldn't produce the documentation. And it's not clear why he couldn't do it, and he couldn't provide his proof to his allegations. But what we do know is at the end of his show, he shot himself live on air. 10 days later, he dies in the hospital.
Oh, it's even worse.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, at least you could have taken yourself out immediately. No, it took almost 2 weeks to die. It's crazy.
That's wild.
Yeah, so we've got less than a year. We've got 10 months to go before the election. And now the opposition party leader just killed himself. And, well, in theory, killed himself, right? He may have Epsteined himself. But you've got all these hyped up anti-corruption advocates. You've got a new generation of students and young professionals who are like, his corruption is bullshit. I'm not cut in on this. This is awful. They saw him and his message as a solution to the country's problems. And suddenly they're left with no one to lead the fight. One of those, by the way, one of those Ortodoxos, who's part of the party, is our favorite future cigar chomper. And he was running as a congressional candidate for Havana. So
at this point, you said Batista was back and he was a senator.
Batista is running. Batista ran for the Senate, correct, in 1948. Yes, so he's back in the government.
So what I don't know, maybe he does, and maybe I'm jumping, but like, how come he's not joining this group and taking over for this group? Because it seems like he did a good job the first time.
You get into my next sentence. So where was I? So the Orthodox Party was leading in the polls leading up to 1952. Suddenly, they're leaderless. Authentico is hopelessly corrupt. Batista, at the head of a new party, was polling in third place. So 10 months to the election, he starts to schmooze the officer corps. These are his people. He takes the Machado approach. He starts to build loyalties directly with the officers of the army. He takes meetings, starts listening to what they need, and he starts making promises. 3 months before the election, he walks into the main military base outside Havana, and he issues a coup d'etat. The military, which had already been in communication with him for a solid 6 months, making deals, coming to an agreement, they basically hand the country over to him. The Authenticos, like Machado, they'd hollowed out civic institutions, so they had left the army as the only functional group with power left in Cuba, once again. The Ortodoxos called for resistance, but they had no leadership. So what could they do? Labor complained, but they were part of the government. They'd been pulled in. So they got on board. They got in line. The middle classes were all exhausted, and they're like, what the fuck's going on? You know what? At least Batista, when Batista was here, we had order in the country, right? Batista was a good leader in the past, so at least that's something, even though this is a fucked up situation. Batista cancels the election. He suspends the Constitution, and he declares himself provisional president. The Republic of Cuba is dead very quickly.
Interesting choice for him. I would have just thought he would have worked with that other group and taken leadership there, and they would have merged, and he would have just won and used the military if necessary to overthrow it and keep the Constitution he helped create. Guess not. Curveball.
Oh, well, that's literally what I want to say next, right? Because in his first decade, the power behind the curtain, and then as the actual official president, he was a smooth political operator. He cultivated a broad coalition. He worked with everyone, right? He worked with the labor people, he worked with the communists, with the students, with everyone. They all got on board, and they all functioned well. Now, he started to act and rule like a guy who knew he hadn't earned it, right? He knew that he had cheated to win, and so he started to act accordingly. Machado's reign was nationalistic and modernizing. Batista's first was populist and militaristic. The Authenticos ran on nationalism, reform, and good governance, but they reigned as grifters. Batista's new reign would be basically a protection racket wrapped in the Cuban flag. He took the worst of the Authentico corruption and he subsumed it into the military apparatus. The gist was, we control the army controls the country, and if you want in on Cuba, you pay us for access and security. He completely got corrupted and sold out. But the business elites, just like some of the middle class, they wanted stability, because stability is an easy path to profits. So they wanted financial success. The business elites got behind him. And a few weeks after the coup, the U.S. saw him as pro-business, good for their financial interests, and they saw him as anti-communist the second time around. So they recognized his government. The vice tourism industry flourished. Wealthy Cubans and tourists had an amazing time in Havana. The wealth gap exploded. The same way that Machado had La Porra, Batista now had SIM, the military intelligence service, enforcing the regime's will. Plenty of student activists, union organizers, opposition politicians, and others were snatched from the streets, tortured, and murdered. There's this undercurrent of violence throughout the entire society at this point. The Authenticos, the Ortodoxos, and the communists, they all struggled to form any sort of resistance to Batista. The Authenticos were completely compromised, the Ortodoxos had no leadership, and the communists at first took this kind of wait-and-see approach. They really didn't kind of step in line one way or another, which really killed their credibility as an opposition party. There's one guy who saw through it and tried to do something, and that was Fidel Castro. He was a former student radical, now robbed of his senatorial bid when Batista canceled the election, and he's pissed. The short version here, I'm not going to dwell too much on the Cuban Revolution because we're getting to the end here, but short version is about a year and a half after Batista takes over, Castro launches a raid on the second largest barracks in Cuba, hoping to spur an island-wide uprising. He fails militarily, but politically he succeeds because he gets a trial and he gets to kind of say his shtick in his defense, and people hear that. He's captured. He's saved from summary execution by a sympathetic officer who's like, yeah, don't kill him. Let's get him to trial. And he's thrown in prison. In 1955, the Batista government, in what is probably an all-time blunder, does a general amnesty for political prisoners and lets Castro and a whole bunch of others free. Castro flees to Mexico, where he meets and hooks up with Che Guevara and Frank Pace, who bring necessary training, a Marxist framework, and underground organizational skills to his cause that he just didn't have on his own. In December of 1956, they return along with Castro's brother Raul and a few dozen other men. There's about 80 or so men. They returned in a failed coordinated military landing and local uprising. Basically, they were going to land, they were going to start some firefights, and then there was also concurrently going to be a civilian uprising in the cities. Basically, they got lost. They ended up like 12 hours after landing time, and the civilian uprising got put down, and then separately the military attack got scattered. They just didn't happen together when it should have. Yeah. So those guys, Raul, Fidel, Che, and Frank, and a few other men, basically about 20 men, survive, and they run off and they retreat into the mountains, and they start to run a guerrilla campaign for the next 2 years. And that campaign is really the critical part. I think that's why ultimately he succeeds, because that really lets him build support among the peasant classes. And at the same time, it gives them time to align the peasant classes who are being repressed and subject to violence, along with the urban underground networks that Frank Pace was cultivating, which aligned the peasants with the middle class people and the people in the city, right? They suddenly were starting to get on the same page. Batista's army, like Machado's before him, was so thoroughly corrupted by the grifting that it was completely ineffective, uninspired, and self-sabotaging. Like, officers were literally selling information to Castro and his group about positions and things of that nature. And the rank and file were like, these guys are just robbing everything. Why am I going to go out here and die and fight for them? Right? Like, this is bullshit. So essentially, his army, Batista's army, starts to crumble. He didn't learn anything from what happened to Machado. In 1958, the US, we're not supporting one group or another, but we cut off shipments to Batista. We're basically like, if he can make it on his own, he can do it, right? But we're not going to continue to give him guns. They do a massive attack to try to dislodge the guerrillas in the mountains in a major offensive, and they don't succeed. From there, the rebels basically slowly sweep across the country, and on New Year's Day, 1959, Batista flees to the Dominican Republic. And that's basically it. And that's how we get Fidel Castro. And that's how we start to get to the current set of U.S.-Cuban relations from this. Like I said, Castro, yeah, he basically closed off the island to people returning, but the violence, the repression, the instability was very much U.S.-backed, and it was very much homegrown by militaristic, nationalistic, democratic governance people within Cuba itself. They just couldn't pull it off for a variety of reasons. And I think, to me, the key through line here, looking through this, is that the Cuban Republic never really found its footing. It really only ever stayed propped up because of military intervention, whether it was foreign intervention by the Spanish or by the U.S., or by local military intervention, right, starting with Batista. And I had anticipated this story being so much more similar to Iran originally, but as I dug in more, I just realized how complex it was. And so I kind of went to, I think, a little bit more detail than I had hoped to originally. But I think, I'm curious to hear from you, right? We are like on the verge of invading Cuba. We've said Cuba's next. We've basically called them out. I don't know. This seems, after the past week, a little bit less likely than it was 2 weeks ago because of just this quagmire we're starting to find ourselves in Iran. But we did have actual direct talks with Cuban leadership this past week. There's no details on what was discussed, but there is diplomatic engagement, which, if we're taking the cues from Iran, is just a precursor to a decapitation strike, right? It's bullshit.
Well, I heard that they let out some prisoners in Cuba. I want to say almost 50 prisoners. I don't know if they were political prisoners, American political prisoners, Cuban political prisoners, or some kind of prisoners, but they released some prisoners. So clearly they want to talk to some extent. But once again, what are you going to do if you do attack them and invade them?
It's a great question.
What is the outcome?
I think that there's one key difference at the moment, right? Which is that Cuba, ever since the attack on, I'm now getting my names confused, Maduro, right? Ever since the Venezuela thing, they have basically been cut off from oil. And at the moment, they are in a major energy crisis on the island, and they are suffering economically and, as a society as a result of this. So I think, unlike Iran, which still has access to its own oil and has a real geographical benefit to being so far away from the US and being such a mountainous, difficult terrain of a country, right? And having the Straits of Hormuz and all that sort of stuff, that's difficult to conquer. Theoretically, we could turn those 15,000 or so active service members that we had stationed in and around Venezuela and just sail right on up to Cuba. I don't know necessarily that would be enough to take it over, but offhand, I see Cuba having a much harder time resisting to military intervention than Iran does.
Yeah, I'm surprised they weren't second. I'm surprised he jumped the shark so fast. But that's great. You take over Cuba, and what is the goal?
I think that you bring up a good one, right? Is why didn't we just jump on that right away? Because they kind of were implying that we were going to. And I think it's because they knew that cut off the oil, they're going to come begging, right? Take away their lifeline, and they're going to need to talk to us to resolve it.
Right.
So I think that's actually a rare, let's call it a win for diplomacy, right? That's actually a rare level-headed approach for this administration. That's actually seems to be sticking to that for the moment. So I'm
really surprised we didn't do it before. I mean, we've embargoed them for so long. We've punished them for so long. Why didn't we just say, all right, you just can't cut you off all together? We didn't want people to suffer. I don't know.
I mean, look, I've kind of always had this view of like, why the hell are we embargoing Cuba? Like, cool, Castro won, and then he repels the Bay of Pigs invasion. And the thing of Castro, right, is every other one of these guys ultimately didn't matter if they were democratic, if they're a military, dictator or whatnot. They ultimately did what the U.S. wanted to some extent. Castro came in, and if he had followed the pattern, he would have turned around and he would have supported the U.S.'s aims in Cuba and gotten on the same page. Castro was a true believer, and he turned around and he was like, we're going to live here as Cubans under Cuban control as a giant fuck you to America. And we're not going to bow to you. Like, the revolution will live on, and it will be a living reminder of what you did to us and how much we hate you. And there was a point to that for him. And that's really why we've kept up the embargo all these years. Because I look at it and go, why? What are we accomplishing? What is this getting us? Nothing. All you've done is basically punish this entire island nation and impoverish them beyond, whatever they would be, just to make a point because Castro was a dick and didn't like you. I don't understand why we're still embargoing them. Like, if
we didn't cut off the oil, then why don't we do this a decade ago, or 20 years ago, and just say, all right, that's it. We're gonna you no longer have energy unless you just can't give in.
I mean, we had the embargo, but other countries traded with them, right? If you
stop it entirely, like we're doing now.
Well, that's what we're doing now, but I don't think. Here's the thing: we're not embargoing them right now. Like, in terms of there's a difference between like an embargo, right, which is we're not trading with them and we're asking others not to trade with them, versus a blockade, right? Like, a blockade is, hello, George Lucas, episode 1, Phantom Menace, right? Then suddenly this shit is real prescient around how the world is working right now. I mean, if there's a more vindicated man in Hollywood than George Lucas, I don't know who it is. So the U.S. never except for the Cuban Missile Crisis, we never blockaded the island. And I believe technically that wasn't even a blockade. It was some sort of some other technicality that we called it. So if we really wanted to push this, the only way to stop it was to stop the flow of oil. The only way to stop the flow of oil from a country like Venezuela that still continued to do business was to change the Venezuelan regime. There was no other legal way to stop it because we're the only ones who hate Cuba the way we do. And the reason we hate Cuba is because Castro decided to kind of keep the revolution going and stick his finger in our face and really kind of rub it in that he wasn't going to bow to our whims and what our desires were on the island. And we took that personally in the same way that we took the Ayatollah's revolution personally in Iran, because we had a lot of money and everything invested there. We had a lot of interest, and the new guy doesn't want to play ball. So we take this hardline approach, which to me is just ridiculous. Like, you got to get over that at a certain point, right? You got to move on.
Most of those people are dead.
Exactly. Stop being so mad at your exes. Like, get over it. Move on with your life. And that's the frustrating thing to me about U.S. foreign policy, is that so often when people are there that we don't like, or they're not doing exactly what we want, and we very firmly want them out, we kind of just stick our fingers in our ears and go, no, I can't hear you, right? We pretend that they don't exist. It's this really immature approach to diplomacy that, frankly, I've always hated about the way we do this. Like, we could have buried the hatchet of Cuba ages ago, and Cuba could be a tourist destination. Absolutely 100%. Why not? Right? It had a nightlife. We could bring back that nightlife. There's no reason. They would want it. We would want it. Why are we doing it? Right? We could have buried the hatchet of Iran ages ago and been like, this isn't worth it. What you did was messed up, but what we did was even more messed up. And we're not going to apologize, and neither should you, but let's move on, right? Let's find a way to play in the sandbox together. We just refuse to do that.
Yeah, we do.
And again, it's not that we don't like strongman dictators who repress their populations. We love them as long as they're doing what we want financially. So,
yes.
So just get on the same page with them, and you can still have them repressing their populations all they want and making money off of it, because clearly as a nation, we don't actually have a problem with that.
Yeah. It's so sad. It's very sad. At least Cuba is kind of like gotten like I mean, they're still getting fucked with the oil, but they got like, all right, they're not going to invade anytime soon. So we got to try to think of some other ways to get some fuel in this country, or just give in altogether. And if we give in altogether, what's that look like? Just a bigger grift, I'm assuming.
I just had the thought, and I haven't fleshed it out, so talk through it with me here, right? Is the Cuban Missile Crisis was the Iran can never have a nuclear bomb of its time. That really is the parallel here. And I guess I never really put that together until just now as we were talking. And I'm just wondering, yeah, how do you... We never resolved that, right? Ultimately, they pulled out the missile launchers, and we continued to embargo them and not talk to them for the next 60 years. So at what point, we got to start finding some solutions here. We got to start finding ways to play nicely together. I don't know, man.
It just must not be profitable for the people who are in charge. And they just like, you know what? That doesn't work for us.
You made a great point. Everyone who got fucked financially on this is dead. They're long dead. They've since written off those assets and made new money, right? So it's not like you've got to settle these balances with any of these countries. You can just be like, enough is enough. And it's time for a new, a new start.
There's probably some fucking degenerate rich people who are like, I still have my property lease and deed to that land. I want it back.
I think that's probably...
You mean the one you stole yourself?
I think
that doesn't matter.
That's the critical one, right? Is you've got a high voting block of Cubans living in America, as I mentioned, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Bob Menendez, and others who lean into that. They want to fight the communism, and they want to fight for these people who feel that Castro took their homeland away from them, when, again, in reality, it wasn't Castro. It was U.S.-backed military regimes between Batista and Machado and their own corrupt politicians, Pace and Grau, who couldn't pull it off, right, and sold out their country to the highest bidder. I don't know. It's an easier story, but that's complex, right? We spent a solid hour going through the critical history of Cuba to understand why it got to where it is and why things are the way they are, and why it's not Castro who did these things to Cubans. It's the Cubans, and the U.S. did these things to Cubans for the most part, right? Castro just closed the door and made it so that it was an easy boogeyman, and also that there wasn't really any reconciliation during the Cold War for these things to happen.
I guess all the thousands of people who left while he was in power, you got to throw them onto the fire pit. People who want to be able to go back.
I'm sure this conversation is probably going to be extremely unpopular with people in the Cuban community. We're going to be pissed off about it, but I'm just calling a spade, right? These guys who are vocal about it, they didn't flee Castro. They fled Batista. They fled Machado, right? That's when so many of these people came here. They came because of the violence of Cubans on Cubans that were backed by the U.S. They did come from Castro, right? Plenty of people from the Mario boat lift. As I mentioned, you have plenty of baseball players who, hopped the boat and fled here for a new life. There were very high profile things of that nature, but it's not one simple answer. And it's not just fuck Castro. It's a lot of things.
It's basically for decades upon decades, whoever led that country made people flee in some way, shape, or form. Castro's brother, whoever comes next has you flee. So we got to find it and arrange it to make it where you guys want to go back and rebuild that country. And if that's what you so choose, I mean, our administration might not let you choose. I don't know, but fix it, right.
I mean, look,
I just think it's just going to be another grift, and it's just going to be, back to square one again.
Yeah, I mean, I hesitate to say that they successfully got their freedom and then fended off other imperial interests, because they didn't, right? They were very much under the U.S.'s thumb, despite having their own sovereignty. But for 57 years, they had their own country, and they fucked it up. Now, you can say the first half of that was still very much directly under the U.S.'s control. I wouldn't argue with you on that. But when the U.S. control went away and the U.S. military intervention went away, it got significantly worse. And you kind of had no one to blame, really, but yourselves at that point. And again,
greed is just overwhelming for people.
Yeah, look, again, I expected this story to be much more similar to Iran, but Iran was very clear cut. The leadership was aligned with the US, and the US was happy to have violence inflicted on the people and to fuck with the country and to take away their sovereignty, and is a very straight line relationship, much more simple and straightforward than this one is.
I think this one just seems to have way more turnover, and maybe it is able to because it's so much smaller than Iran. So it just could be like, hey, Jim, you want to get a couple people together and fucking overthrow this thing? Sounds good. Who do you know? Let's just do it tomorrow.
Also, it doesn't have the 2,500-year history of the Persians and the Persian Empire and that whole region, right? This is a country that had a native population that got wiped out. I believe it's the Taino peoples who live there. I could be wrong about that one. But Christopher Columbus comes along and the native populations get wiped out. So basically everyone who's there is, as I mentioned, right, 80% of the Cubans were first, second, third, fourth generation Spaniards as of, less than 200 years ago. So,
and that's the other big thing. And that's what usually really makes these things so much more complicated and takes so much longer to overturn. Religion's not involved. It's all about freedom and wealth. There is no sect, I'm guessing, in Cuba that's a certain Catholic that wants to exterminate all the other Catholics.
Yeah, there was some, element of, it's very much like a mestizo, like a mixed race group there. But yeah, at no point in any of the research that I read was really religion some sort of a factor in any of this, right? They came from Spain, so presumably it's all very Catholic. But at no point did I hear anything about the Pope intervening or whatnot. Again, I'm not a researcher. I'm not a historian. So, I'm doing my best to collaborate, I
think that would come out front and center if there was some kind of strange religious sect that was trying to gain power in some way.
Yeah, and I do my best to collate first and second perspective sources on this from people who've done this. So, again, I didn't run into any of that. So that definitely simplifies some of it. But what that does, I think, to your point, Adam, it makes it so that more people can move in more directions. When you kind of remove that religion factor, it kind of frees things up.
And then it becomes just a money thing where it just becomes whoever wants to grift who and whoever wants to take power. There's none of those other things standing in their way. It's just a form of government that we could exploit.
All right, my friend. Viva la revolucion. And let's go drink some Cuba Libres.
Sounds good. You got me in the mood for one.
Yeah, exactly. I'm definitely ordering one tonight. All right, I'll catch you later.
That's available. All right, bye.
Bye.
Idiot Seeking Village is a production of Village Idiots Media. For more, find us online at villageidiotmedia.com or find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, and wherever you get podcasts.